The morning sun spilled golden light over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge Estates, a place that prided itself on perfect lawns, manicured hedges, and spotless driveways. For years, the community had been run with an iron fist by the HOA president, a woman known by everyone, and feared by most, Karen Whitmore. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her voice carried authority that silenced even the most confident homeowners. But today wasn't about Karen. Today was supposed to be my day, the day I married the love of my life. After months of planning, budgeting, and stress, everything was finally falling into place. The flowers were delivered, the guests were seated, and the vintage white limo I had rented gleamed in the sunlight, waiting to take us to the chapel. It felt like a dream come true, until Karen appeared. She stood at the end of my driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed, sunglasses perched like armor against the world. The limo driver, a polite older man named Ray, honked once, gently, to signal that we were ready to leave. But Karen didn't move. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe she was talking to someone or inspecting a neighbor's hedge again. But then I saw her pointing at the limo, shaking her head, mouthing words I couldn't hear from the window of my house. Ray tried to inch forward, but she stepped in front of the car. My stomach dropped. Time ticked by, 5 minutes, then 10. Guests waiting at the chapel were already texting, wondering if we'd been delayed. I could see my bridesmaids exchanging anxious glances. Ray rolled down his window, trying to reason with her, but Karen stood her ground. She was saying something about violating community regulations and unauthorized commercial vehicles. She was blocking my wedding limo. The audacity left me speechless. My fiancé, Daniel, came rushing out of the house, his tie barely knotted, confusion written all over his face. I could feel the heat of embarrassment burning my cheeks as curious neighbors peeked through curtains, watching the spectacle unfold. Karen wasn't just blocking a car, she was ruining the most important day of my life. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Ray backed up and tried to maneuver around her. Karen stepped aside, smirking as if she'd won some invisible battle. I didn't understand it then, but to her, this wasn't personal, it was power. She had found a way to remind everyone who controlled Oak Ridge Estates. We finally arrived at the chapel almost 40 minutes late. My perfectly timed schedule was destroyed. The officiant was annoyed, the photographer rushed, and some guests had even left, assuming something terrible had happened. I smiled through the ceremony, holding back tears, pretending that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew something inside me had cracked. The night should have ended in laughter and dancing. Instead, every toast, every smile felt hollow. People whispered about the HOA incident, turning my wedding into neighborhood gossip. Even after the honeymoon, Karen's smugness continued. A week later, I found a notice taped to my mailbox, a fine for obstructing a public roadway with an oversized vehicle. The vehicle, of course, was my wedding limo. That was the moment the anger solidified into resolve. Karen had embarrassed me publicly, sabotaged my wedding day, and then fined me for it. No one else had ever dared challenge her authority, but I would. So, I started watching. Observing. Learning that I attended HOA meetings quietly, sitting in the back, pretending to take notes about landscaping or garbage bins. Karen dominated every discussion, shooting down suggestions that didn't align with her personal taste. She bullied the treasurer into submission, ignored complaints about her own violations, and flaunted her position like a badge of superiority. But the thing about power is, people get careless when they think no one can touch them. By the end of the month, I had found the first crack in her armor. She was using HOA funds to pay for her personal gardener. Not just any gardener, the same one who maintained her private rose garden, which she proudly boasted was the heart of Oak Ridge. The receipts didn't lie. I made copies. I saved emails. And I smiled to myself every time I passed her on the street, acting polite, knowing what was coming. Because I wasn't just planning revenge, I was preparing a lesson. A lesson Karen would never forget. As autumn leaves began to fall and the HOA prepared for its annual board election, I knew the timing was perfect. Soon, everyone in Oak Ridge Estates would see the truth behind the perfect hedges and painted smiles. And Karen? She'd never see it coming. After the humiliation of the wedding, anger alone would not be enough. I knew that to take Karen down I needed a plan crafted with patience, precision, and proof. Revenge, I decided, would be surgical, not petty. It would be public and undeniable. It would show the neighborhood the real cost of unchecked power. So I turned the hurt into a mission, and the mission into a quiet war. The first step was documentation. I transformed my home office into a miniature investigation unit. Receipts, emails, photographs, and HOA statutes were spread across the dining table like evidence in a courtroom drama. I scanned invoices, cross-checked bank statements I could legally access through public HOA reports, and pulled archived meeting minutes from the HOA website. Every discrepancy I found became a thread to pull. Every thread revealed more: landscaper invoices showing identical charges billed to the HOA and to Karen's property, a maintenance company paid for, common area pruning, that also pruned the hedges in front of her house, invoices dated for weekends when no community job was scheduled. The pattern stank of self-dealing. But paperwork alone wouldn't sway people who idolized Karen's tidy lawns and polished smile. I needed witnesses. I began with neighbors who had small grievances they'd buried to avoid confrontation. A retired teacher who'd received an absurd fine for a gnome on his porch, a young family who'd been denied permission to install a small ramp for their toddler despite clear precedent, a contractor who whispered that the same person who got the HOA contracts also got the preferred contractor emails. Each whispered complaint became a testimony when I gently coaxed them into recording their memories, always careful to remind them that truth doesn't require drama, only honesty. I learned the power of timing. The annual HOA board election was approaching, and Karen, predictably, was entrenched in a re-election campaign. She circulated glossy flyers, organized a neighborhood beautification fundraiser, and appeared at every block party with a tray of cookies and a rehearsed smile. But beneath that veneer, she was anxious. People who hold power long enough transform slights into policy, they grow sloppy. Karen's arrogance had made her sloppy. I did not start with accusations. I started with questions that led to documents. I requested copies of vendor contracts under the HOA's transparency rules. I filed formal complaints about the questionable charges, forcing the board to acknowledge them in writing. The board responded publicly with platitudes about fiscal responsibility, but internally, their cords of complicity shook. Some members reacted with hostility, others with cautious curiosity. I cultivated the latter. I met with the treasurer, a man who'd been too afraid to speak up. Once he realized the invoices didn't line up, relief replaced fear. His silence had been purchased with intimidation, now, the scales were tipping. Social media, used properly, can be a megaphone. I set up a private neighborhood group not to inflame, but to inform. It was a careful, neutral space where residents could post questions and documents, where I posted scanned resolutions and screenshots of emails with redacted personal data. Each post was factual, time-stamped, and unemotional. Authenticity has a way of cutting through manufactured charm. People started to comment, small confirmations at first, then longer narratives. The energy shifted from "don't make waves" to "we deserve transparency." Legal channels were the other blade I sharpened. I spoke to a lawyer recommended by a neighbor who had once worked in municipal compliance. The lawyer explained how the misuse of HOA funds, if proven, could lead to criminal as well as civil consequences for those who authorized and concealed it. That was not my goal. I didn't want to ruin people, only to expose corruption and restore fairness. Still, the existence of legal teeth changed the board dynamics overnight. Suddenly, members who had been content to smile with Karen at barbecues realized the potential cost of complicity. The campaign shifted into stealth mode. I arranged for a forensic accountant to review the public financial statements, the bill would be covered by a crowdfunding campaign framed as a community audit rather than a personal vendetta. Volunteers manned a simple hotline for people to report anomalies securely. We offered anonymity. Some people were still terrified of Karen's retribution. Slowly, documents that had been buried for months surfaced, change orders with zero justification, emergency repairs coinciding suspiciously with Karen's private landscaping projects, and a trail of small-dollar transactions that collectively formed a substantial misallocation of funds. On election day, the turnout was unprecedented. People lined up to cast ballots, some still hesitant, many curious. Volunteer poll watchers ensured transparency, no ballot boxes were left unattended. When the final tally came in, it was clear that the neighborhood had spoken. Karen retained her seat, but her margin of victory had thinned dramatically, and two of her staunchest allies had been unseated. It was not a final victory, but it was the beginning of the end. Yet Karen did not fade gracefully. The morning after the election, a package arrived for me, a thick envelope of legal summons and demands, alleging slander, threatening court action, and demanding retraction of alleged false statements. It was a crude attempt to bankrupt my resolve. Lawsuits are expensive, and small communities can be crushed by legal fees. I took a deep breath and handed the envelope to the lawyer I had consulted. The lawyer's face was steady. "They can file," she said, "but they'll need to prove malice. Truth is a defense." That reassurance was a balm, but it was also a clarion call. The fight would move to a new battlefield, formal investigations, possible audits, and a public accounting that could not be undone by polished smiles and polite refusals. I felt the adrenaline of the hunt again, but this time it was tempered by the knowledge that I had allies, lawyers, and documented facts on my side. As autumn deepened and the leaves browned, the neighborhood braced for the fallout. Karen held court on her porch, assembling a new playbook of retaliation that included petty fines, opaque contractor contracts, and whispered threats. But she had underestimated the resilience of a community that had tasted truth. From the gallery of my living room window, I watched her move like a chess player who realizes he has lost control of the center. She was not defeated, not yet, but her moves were frantic, and panic makes mistakes. I was ready for them. I had the documents, the witnesses, the social platform, and the legal counsel. Most importantly, I had the moral high ground. The stage was set for the final act. The community had been roused from complacency, alliances had shifted, and the first formal audit request had been filed. The next phase would not be about whispers or secret meetings, it would be about accountability in the light of day. And Karen? She thought she could frighten me into silence. Instead, her threats had sharpened my resolve. The war, once quiet and methodical, was about to become public and uncompromising. Winter crept into Oak Ridge Estates like a whisper, soft, cold, and cleansing. The air carried the faint scent of pine and frost, and with it came the hum of anticipation. For months, the neighborhood had been a quiet battlefield of whispers and rumors, of papers shuffled behind closed doors and questions dodged at HOA meetings. But now, there would be no more hiding. The audit had been approved. It began as a small announcement buried in the community newsletter, a simple line: "An independent review of HOA financial practices will be conducted in January." To most, it was routine. To those who knew, it was the fuse on a powder keg. Karen tried to downplay it, smiling at neighbors, insisting it was a formality, her favorite word when cornered. But even her usual confidence had started to crack. She was late to meetings, snapping at board members, and her once immaculate rose garden was now neglected, the petals browning and falling into the cold dirt. The woman who once ruled Oak Ridge Estates with precision and pride looked like she was holding her empire together with trembling fingers. The audit began quietly. The accountant team requested documents, expense reports, and vendor contracts. Karen stalled, citing missing files and technical delays. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't need cooperation, it only needs time. One by one, inconsistencies emerged. Duplicate payments, unapproved reimbursements. And, most damning of all, personal expenses labeled as community improvements. Her rose garden wasn't just a personal indulgence, it had been funded by the very people she fined for cracked sidewalks and overgrown lawns. The receipts were clear. The accountant's report landed like a thunderclap at the next HOA meeting. For once, every seat was filled. The normally sleepy gatherings where only a handful of residents showed up had turned into a spectacle. People who had once whispered in fear now sat upright, waiting. The treasurer's voice shook as he read the summary aloud: misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of HOA bylaws. Karen sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw locked. She tried to interrupt, claiming bias, claiming misunderstanding, but each protest crumbled under evidence. The room wasn't angry at first. It was silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then someone asked the question everyone had been holding: so what happens now? The answer came from the new vice president, one of the reform candidates I had helped support. A motion was raised to remove Karen as HOA president, effective immediately, pending legal review. The vote was nearly unanimous. Even her remaining allies, those who had defended her to the end, lowered their eyes as they cast their votes. Karen didn't wait for the conclusion. She stood up, face pale, muttering something about ungrateful neighbors and political sabotage. Her heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor as she stormed out, the sound echoing through the hall like the final toll of a bell. For the first time in years, the neighborhood exhaled. But my satisfaction wasn't rooted in revenge, it was in justice. Because after the meeting, people stayed behind. They talked. They laughed. They reconnected. The fear that had hung over Oak Ridge Estates like a permanent fog had finally lifted. Within weeks, the board announced new transparency measures, open financial records, rotating committee chairs, and public votes for major expenditures. The community began to heal. Lawns looked less like trophies and more like homes again. Children played in the park without Karen's watchful eyes scanning for unauthorized use. The neighborhood felt alive. As for Karen, she didn't disappear quietly. She filed a lawsuit claiming defamation and wrongful removal. But the mountain of evidence dismantled her claims before they even reached a hearing. The HOA's insurance attorneys handled the response, and her case was dismissed in record time. A few months later, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of her house. The once pristine garden was overgrown, the roses now tangled and wild. She moved out quietly, under the gray light of an early spring morning. Some neighbors peeked through curtains as the moving truck loaded box after box, but no one said goodbye. The Queen of Oak Ridge had fallen, not by fury, but by truth. Life didn't return to what it was before, because it became better. The HOA transformed into something resembling what it was meant to be, a body that served the people, not ruled them. The new board instituted volunteer cleanups, small community events, and transparent budgets. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates wasn't just a place to live, it was a place to belong. I still kept the old wedding limo photo, the one taken before Karen blocked the driveway. In that picture, I looked radiant but unaware, frozen in the moment before everything went wrong. Now, when I looked at it, I didn't see anger or pain. I saw the spark of what that day started. Because if Karen hadn't blocked my wedding limo, if she hadn't humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood, none of this would have happened. Sometimes, the people who try to break you are the ones who end up building your strength. A few weeks later, during a sunny afternoon, I walked past. Karen blocked the driveway. In that picture, I looked radiant but unaware, frozen in the moment before everything went wrong. Now, when I looked at it, I didn't see anger or pain. I saw the spark of what that day started. That I smiled to myself as I walked on, the air calm and bright. The neighborhood no longer whispered about fear or fines. It whispered about change, about second chances. I smiled to myself as I walked on, the air calm and bright. The neighborhood no longer whispered about fear or fines. It whispered about change, about second chances. And though I never sought vengeance in the cruel sense, Karen had learned her lesson the only way she ever could, by losing everything she had used to control others. Justice didn't need anger. It only needed patience, persistence, and truth. And that, in the end, was the real victory.